I still remember the day when everything started to unravel. Life in the countryside had suited my family perfectly, but for some reason, my in-laws seemed to think of our home as an open invitation. This wasn't a hotel, after all, but our space, our home. My husband Ethan had never been a demanding person before. However, when his mother came to stay, he grew bold, even downright unreasonable. No need to bring in people who look like they can't handle their own finances, he'd mutter whenever my father visited. Ethan's sneer would only get worse. If you don't like it, you can leave, he'd say. I stayed silent, pity filling me more than anger, as his words cut through the air. My father may have been between jobs, but he was far from destitute. Seeing Ethan eager to impress his mother at any cost filled me with disgust. I decided to leave. Fine, I'll go, but you'll have to handle everything that comes after, I replied, watching as they joyfully saw me off, thinking they'd won. My name is Selena. I'm 33 and run a real estate company, a business my father started years ago and handed over to me only recently. Although I'm the company president, I still feel new to it, as my father stepped down just 2 years ago. His retirement came as a shock. He'd been planning to work for years, but was adamant about wanting to focus on family, saying he regretted missing out on those years. His wife, my mother, had moved back to her hometown a few years prior to help care for my grandmother. My father decided it was time for him to join her and finally put his family first. While I respected his decision, I also felt the pressure of taking on the company, wondering if I was too young for such a role. I pleaded for him to reconsider, but he was firm. The employees trust you. You'll rise to the challenge, he assured me. So I accepted, grateful for his confidence and ready to take on the responsibility. Around this time, I married Ethan, whom I'd met through work. My father admired him, calling him capable and sincere, but my mother had her doubts, especially when she learned about Ethan's close relationship with his mother. His mother had raised him alone after his parents' divorce. She warned me that I might end up sharing my life with her too. Although I wasn't thrilled by the idea, I was prepared to live with her if it came to that. Thankfully, Ethan told me that his mother enjoyed her freedom and had a new partner, which eased my mind. After our marriage, we moved into my apartment. But after my father relocated to my mother's hometown, we had the option to move into my parents' old luxury apartment. Ethan was thrilled at the idea. It's so much bigger, and we'll need the space when we have kids, he reasoned. I agreed, especially since the apartment was owned by my company, making the move seamless. Settling into the spacious apartment, I could see Ethan was more than pleased. I'm so lucky I married you, he'd say, gazing at the view. He seemed to think I had purchased it from my father. How much did you buy this for? He'd ask, even suggesting that maybe my father had gifted it to us. I decided to let him believe this, hoping he'd take on some financial responsibility. Yet he didn't contribute at all, assuming I'd cover everything since I was now the president of a successful company. One evening, my father called, asking if we were enjoying the apartment. Does Ethan appreciate it? He teased, hinting that he had told Ethan a story about the apartment's expense. I realized then why Ethan thought I had depleted my savings to buy it. Yet despite this impression, Ethan didn't lift a finger to help with expenses, and even acted as if he owned the place. He bragged to people about our luxury apartment, but I couldn't bring myself to tell him we were renting it from my company. After we moved, his mother started visiting often. She loved the view, and Ethan, in a moment of excitement, suggested she move in. Your house is getting old. You'd love it here, he said, ignoring my shocked expression. His mother hesitated, saying Selena might not like that, but Ethan brushed her concerns aside. I was troubled by his sudden enthusiasm for living with his mother, especially since we'd agreed that space was important in close relationships. When I voiced my concerns, he snapped, "This is my house. There's no problem. If my mother lives here," the more he spoke, the more I realized he truly thought He owned the place. He hadn't reviewed the rental agreement which I had signed under his name, and he had no idea that the apartment wasn't ours. Deciding not to correct him, I simply stated that his mother's new partner couldn't move in with us. Ethan grew defensive and evasive, avoiding my questions. Our arguments increased, especially since he wouldn't help with household expenses. Distressed, I reached out to my father for advice. My father sensed my concern. "I thought you'd live together eventually, but this seems rushed. If it's necessary, I'll come to help sort things out." Around this time, my grandmother's health suddenly deteriorated, and she passed away soon after. I tried reaching Ethan, but he was unresponsive and only returned my call much later, cheerful and indifferent. When he didn't attend the funeral, my parents were disappointed, and his absence left me feeling alone. After the service, I returned home to find that his mother had already moved in. "I've moved everything. Looks like I'll be staying here now," she said, beaming. Ethan's reaction stunned me even more. "Your grandmother's passing was perfectly timed," he sneered. "Now Mom can live here without interruptions." His disrespect for my family was infuriating, and I had no choice but to accept that his mother was now living with us. She quickly took control, demanding I handle all household chores as if I were her servant. Whenever I confronted Ethan, he'd insist that I should be grateful to have such a supportive mother-in-law. I couldn't take it anymore. His mother even began inviting her boyfriend, who was close to Ethan's age, over to our apartment. I felt both anger and disbelief seeing a man my husband's age lounging in my home, demanding I cook for him. Is she being deceived? I asked Ethan, but he dismissed my concerns, though I could tell he was uncomfortable and doubting the man's intentions. Things came to a head when my mother called, wanting to visit for a few days to honor relatives who had helped with my grandmother's funeral. I had to break the news to her about Ethan's mother moving in, which shocked her. "We need to address this," she said, urging my father to come along. When I told Ethan about their visit, he was furious and lashed out, his mother joining in to defend him. I could feel our home becoming more of a battleground than a sanctuary. With nowhere else to turn, I moved out, taking only my essentials and settling into an empty property owned by my company. When I told my parents, my mother was outraged. "Why did you have to leave? This apartment should be yours," she insisted, unaware that the apartment was a rental. My father explained, revealing that Ethan had misunderstood our living situation from the beginning. I decided it was time to set things straight with Ethan. Returning to the apartment, I showed him the rental contract. He was stunned, realizing he'd been living under a false assumption all along. His mother reacted furiously, refusing to leave. "I sold my house for this," she cried, revealing that she'd been financially supporting her boyfriend, who had now vanished, taking her money with him. It was clear that Ethan and his mother had no way of affording the rent, which was substantial. Faced with this reality, I presented divorce papers to Ethan, unwilling to stay in a marriage filled with lies and disrespect. Despite his reluctance, my father insisted, saying, "I thought you were a better man, but I was wrong." With my family's support, I started over, free from the toxic environment that had consumed my life. I felt a sense of relief as Ethan and his mother finally left the apartment, moving into a rundown house. I later heard that her boyfriend had been arrested, though the money she had given him was gone, leaving them with enormous debt, a grim consequence of their choices. Ethan tried to contact me several times, hoping to reconcile, but I refused. I couldn't forgive the way he had treated me and my family, and I was determined to move forward. Threatening to report him for harassment, I made it clear that he had no place in my life anymore. Returning to live with my parents, I found a renewed sense of purpose. The painful experiences had not only strengthened my resolve, but also reminded me of the value of my family's unwavering support. Each day now feels like a fresh start, filled with gratitude and determination to build a future rooted in respect and integrity.